Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here nice and early, and we're excited to get started with our first session. My name is Amber Taylor, and I'm the moderator for this first session this morning. The first announcement is the most exciting announcement. It's that it starts with an unfortunate part, which is that Brett Dowdle won't be able to be here today. His wife very early this morning gave birth, so we're very excited for him and very much congratulate him. But we were able to get a hold of him. Jordan, who is presenting, was able to get a hold of him and see if he could send him a copy of his paper. So assuming that goes through all right, we'll have Jordan read his paper. We just won't be able to ask him questions in the question and answer session. All right, so let me get started with some information on our presenters this morning. Brett, who isn't with us, is a historian for the Joseph Smith Papers Project at the Church History Department, just across the street. He has been a volume editor on Joseph Smith Papers Documents Volume 8, 11, and 15. He holds a PhD in American History from Texas Christian University and a BA and MA in History from Brigham Young University. He and his family live in Orem, Utah, his growing family. And his paper, should we be so honored to hear it, is entitled Combating the Other Relic, Antipolygamy and the Formation of the Republican Party, 1854 to 1857, in which he explores the way that the Republican Party has been influenced by the question of combating polygamy in the latter half of the 19th century.
Okay. So yesterday I became a dad, and thought I maybe wasn't going to be here presenting, but Maddie, my wife, told me that I should present, and I show up and find out that Brett's wife has had a child, and I'm presenting two papers. So I apologize to Brett. I probably won't do it justice, but I will give it a shot. So this is Brett's paper, Combating the Other Relic. On March 20th, 1854, a small group of disgruntled politicians assembled in a little white schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin, to establish a new political party which would come to be known as the Republican Party. Little more than 2 years later, this handful of northern politicians would begin to enact policies that would shape Utah for the remainder of the 19th century. While for most Americans, the Republican Party would become the party of Lincoln, for most 19th century Latter-day Saints, it would become the party of Justin S. Morrill, Shelby M. Cullom, and George F. Edmunds, names that would elicit anger and at times even terror within Latter-day Saint memory. But in 1854, few saints could have predicted just how significant an effect that small gathering of politicians in Ripon, Wisconsin would have upon their lives. The story of how the Utah question came within the crosshairs of the nascent Republican Party by 1856 is an intriguing one that highlights events both within Utah and upon the national stage. When plural marriage was included alongside slavery in the 1856 Republican Party platform, it signaled an identity for the early Republican Party as a party of national ideological reconstruction. Years before the Republicans would pass their first pieces of reconstructive legislation in 1862, they had begun to signal that the aims of their party would be to identify and ideologically reconstruct those who fell beyond the pale of 19th century American citizenship. Republicans not only used Utah to posit themselves in direct opposition to the key democratic principle of popular sovereignty, but they ironically found ready evidence for the need to focus the nation upon Utah in the lives and experiences of Democratic appointees to Utah. On September 9, 1850, Congress passed a piece of legislation which, among other things, established the landlocked regions of the Great Basin as the territory of Utah. The Latter-day Saint settlements in the territory represented important way stations along the overland trail to the newly established gold fields in California. Likely in an effort to appease the Saints, U.S. President Millard Fillmore agreed that the territorial government would be composed of both Latter-day Saints and other appointees from outside the territory. While Brigham Young was appointed to be the territory's first governor, the justices on the territorial Supreme Court tended to be individuals who were chosen from outside the Latter-day Saint populace. Throughout the 1850s, this dynamic led to frequent disputes between federally appointed judges and Young. The first of these showdowns occurred in September 1851, not long after the first federal justices arrived in the Great Salt Lake City. During a meeting of the Saints on September 8, 1851, Young introduced Justice Perry Brocas to the congregation. Following Young's introduction, Brocas spoke to the gathering and chastised them on a variety of matters. His comments included an appeal to Utah's women to become virtuous. Within days of the sermon, Brocas and some of the other appointees left Utah, journeying toward Washington, D.C., where they began to warn of the fanaticism of the people and of the violence of feelings toward the Gentiles among Latter-day Saints. Soon after arriving in Washington, D.C., the officials, dubbed runaways by the Saints, authored a scathing report on the extraordinary state of affairs in Utah. Among other things, the officials argued that Latter-day Saint leaders were usurping and exercising the functions of legislation and the judicial business of the territory, organizing and commanding the military, disposing of the public lands upon its own terms, coining money, and, perhaps most problematic of all, were openly sanctioning and defending the practice of polygamy, or plurality of wives. In addition to precipitating the formal announcement of plural marriage, this conflict helped to set the tone for decades of antipathy between Latter-day Saints and the federally appointed officers who were sent to Utah. Comparatively speaking, the years that followed from 1833 to 1855 were relatively calm ones for Utah. Events of these years, however, proved monumental to the formation of Utah history and in the development of the Republican crusade against polygamy. Among the problems that continued to materialize during the time was the ongoing struggle to determine ultimate sovereignty in the territory. During a June 1853 sermon, Brigham Young remarked, "I have no fears whatever of Franklin Pierce excusing me from office and saying that another man shall be the governor of this territory. We have got a territorial government, and I am and will be governor, and no power can hinder it until the Lord Almighty says, 'Brigham, you need not be governor any longer,' and then I am willing to yield to another governor." More than a year later, the sermon began to raise red flags in the eastern states, and at the very time where U.S. President Franklin Pierce began vigorously trying to find a suitable replacement for Young. Accordingly, Young's remarks stoked national fears about the Latter-day Saint community and whether it would submit to federal authority. The Savannah Daily Morning News warned that any replacement for Young would likely be welcomed to the territory by Judge Lynch. And both the Washington, D.C. Evening Star and Missouri's Glasgow Weekly Times theorized that a new governor could only be installed in Utah if sent along with a complementary military force. Around the same time as these questions about the governorship of Utah were beginning to take hold, Pierce was issuing appointments for 3 new justices on Utah's territorial Supreme Court. While Pierce found a Chief Justice for Utah's territorial Supreme Court relatively quickly, appointing John F. Kinney of Iowa to the position in late December 1853, filling the posts of the Associate Justices proved to be more difficult. In October 1853, Attorney General Caleb Cushing had appointed John W. Underwood of Georgia and George Edmunds of Illinois to the positions. While Underwood quickly declined the appointment, Edmunds seemed to be a favorable appointment for Utah. A resident of Quincy, Illinois, Edmunds had a close association with both Emma Smith and John Bernheisel. While Edmunds planned to arrive in Utah and begin his duties during the spring of 1854, his failing health prevented him from making the journey and forced his resignation by October 1854. In hopes of securing an appointee that would be favorable to the Saints, Bernheisel suggested the names of Saints Seth M. Blair, Zerubbabel Snow, William Appleby, along with James W. Woods, brother-in-law to Daniel H. Wells. Despite some initial favorability toward the suggestion of Appleby in particular, however, Pierce ultimately declined to appoint any of Bernheisel's recommendations. Selecting his own replacements for Underwood and Edmunds, Pierce appointed Iowa politician George Stiles and Illinois judge William Drummond to the Utah court. Drummond and Stiles were intriguing choices. Stiles had served as the Nauvoo city attorney and had become a Latter-day Saint in August 1844, with Brigham Young performing his baptism. His early church devotion had even included taking a plural wife on January 19, 1846. Subsequent to that marriage, however, his first wife, Sophia Schofield, promptly divorced Stiles, making it highly unlikely that Pierce knew anything of Stiles' earlier practice of polygamy. While not a Latter-day Saint, Drummond similarly had close connections with Utah. In 1830, he had married Jemima McClellan in Kentucky. During the 1830s and 40s, 4 of her siblings became Latter-day Saints. According to one sibling, Jemima similarly expressed an interest in the church, but was prevented from joining it by her husband. Perhaps due to Drummond's familial connections to the saints, John Bernheisel at first described him as a pleasantly gentlemanly man, while the Chicago Weekly Times described him as a gentleman of the highest manners, strict integrity, and high legal and literary attainments. Accordingly, on the surface, these appointments seemed as if they would prove to be highly beneficial to Utah. But while these appointments may have seemed favorable, these appointees would further undermine both federal and public perceptions of Utah, ultimately igniting the 1857-58 Utah War. At the same time as these appointments were being made, events were taking place on the national level that would have a dramatic impact on Utah. During May 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, establishing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. More significantly, the act established the political doctrine of popular sovereignty, allowing both territories to use the popular vote to determine whether they were free or slave territories. The language of the act declared the new territories perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States. Although the Kansas-Nebraska Act related to the organization and regulation of those two territories, it had broader implications that did not escape the notice of many within the United States, including Latter-day Saints. With regards to the question of slavery, the act made it possible for all new territories to become open to the institution of slavery, obliterating earlier agreements which would have limited slavery to territories and states that fell south of Missouri's southern border. Furthermore, as historian Brent Rogers has skillfully demonstrated, Latter-day Saints saw within the language of the legislation a larger political doctrine that could be utilized to justify their own peculiar institution of polygamy. For instance, during an interview with Pierce, John Taylor noted that Young was the governor of choice among the residents of Utah, and that the people considered, according to certain popular doctrines, that their wishes ought to be somewhat consulted in relation to who governed them. Taylor believed that the Democrats were obligated to defend the saints upon the doctrine of polygamy in order to defend the doctrine of popular sovereignty. The Latter-day Saint efforts to appropriate the doctrine of popular sovereignty, however, were not the only way that the Kansas-Nebraska Act affected Utah and the Latter-day Saints. Even before it was signed into law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act outraged anti-slavery Northerners from a broad range of political parties. In response to the bill, anti-slavery Northerners combined to establish the Republican Party. While anti-slavery would be the main focus of the party for the first decade of its existence, in both ideology and practice, it became the party of Reconstructive Reform. This broader reconstructive purpose of the party influenced its response to questions surrounding the settlement of the West, national education, immigration, and plural marriage. In each case, their aim was to systematize and codify the boundaries of Americanism and national citizenship. Less than 2.5 years after the party's founding, it would become clear that Latter-day Saints did not fall within the pale of American citizenship that the Republican Party would come to adhere to in the 19th century. As Latter-day Saints took up the position that popular sovereignty could protect a territory's decision to practice polygamy as much as it could to protect a territory's decision to allow slavery, Utah came squarely within the crosshairs of the newly organized Republican Party. Ironically, it would be the efforts of Pierce's 3 Democratic appointees to the Utah Territorial Supreme Court that would provide the Republicans with much of the fodder that would fuel the 1850s beginnings of a Republican crusade against Utah that would last until 1890. Although each of Pierce's judicial appointments to Utah would influence the prevailing opinions about the territory during their terms of service, no individual would be more influential in shaping public opinion about Utah than was William Drummond. As previously mentioned, Drummond was married to Jemima McClellan, a close relative of some Latter-day Saints who had immigrated to Utah. Despite this marriage, however, Drummond made the journey to Utah with a woman who went by the name of Ada Carroll, a prominent prostitute that he had made the acquaintance of in Washington, D.C., and then referred to her as his wife during his time in the territory, an inconsistency which would be noted by Latter-day Saints. Throughout his time in Utah, Drummond became a prominent critic of the community, writing letters with damning critiques to both newspapers and politicians back in the States. Soon after his arrival in the territory, he wrote a letter to the Chicago Daily Times, in which he stated that far too many of the Latter-day Saints were basely corrupt, an allusion to the practice of polygamy. Within months of his arrival, Drummond was calling upon U.S. Attorney General Caleb Cushing to ban all future appointments of Latter-day Saints to positions within the territory, stating that this was necessary because such a state of things does not exist on the face of the earth as exists in this territory. In particular, he urged Young's immediate replacement as governor. Drummond's actions ran counter to the notions of popular sovereignty and the desire of Utahns to be governed by political officers of their own choosing. Accordingly, Heber C. Kimball and others soon began to worry that Drummond was quickly becoming a bitter enemy of their community. Issuing a public rebuke, Young directed a public address toward Drummond and the other judges, stating that the role of the territory's governing officers was only to act for the people and do what we wish to have done. He emphasized that the judges are not here as kings and monarchs, but rather were subject to keep the laws of the territory as well as other citizens. Privately, Young was even more critical, stating that Drummond often and in various ways transcended his authority. The judge was, in Young's estimation, proud as a peacock and ignorant as a jackass. Days after Young's public remarks, the Salt Lake Probate Court began issuing a litany of charges against both Drummond and Kinney. Although the charges were dismissed less than a week later, both the charges and Young's remarks emphasized a significant power struggle in the territory between the sovereignty of the federal government and that of the territorial citizens. Responding to this power struggle, Drummond and other officials wrote to Pierce and Cushing, describing Young as one of the most terrible tyrants ever on earth and as a hostile and bitter assailant of the present administration. They further argued that unless all Latter-day Saints were removed from political office, federal officials would find themselves in danger of violence at the hands of assassins. In spite of the growing questions surrounding federal sovereignty in Utah, Latter-day Saint leaders remained optimistic about the prospects of Utah receiving statehood in 1856. They were convinced that the territory's petition would receive a favorable reception throughout the country, and especially among Democrats. Indeed, given the increasingly problematic nature of the nation's sectional divisions and the ascendancy of the Republican Party as a legitimate competitor, admission of the heavily Democratic Utah as a state made logical sense for Democrats. Furthermore, Utah presented a more stable option than the conflict-ridden territory of Kansas, a contrast that was noted by the New York Herald in early June 1856. Just weeks after the Herald's article was published, however, the Latter-day Saint hopes for Utah statehood had come crashing down, as John A. Willis, a Republican from San Francisco, urged his party to include a firm statement against polygamy in its first national platform. Willis later recalled that the opportunity to publish the party's first political platform had presented a unique opportunity to make war upon polygamy, and at the same time strengthen the case against slavery as much as possible by associating the two together. By linking polygamy to slavery as the twin relics of barbarism, the Republicans tapped into a deep undercurrent of national unease about the circumstances in Utah and dealt a stunning blow to the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which had undergirded democratic power in the 1850s. Despite hopes that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to defend popular sovereignty and deny Utah's rights to the institution of plural marriage at the same time, Utah's delegation to appeal for statehood noted an immediate shift in public opinions with regards to the territory's admission. For instance, George A. Smith recalled an almost instantaneous change in his interactions with Congressman Mordecai Oliver of Missouri. The day before news of the platform had reached them, Oliver spoke very favorably of our admission and pronounced it good. The following day, Oliver and other representatives had become very distant and began to raise objections to the admission of Utah. By the time Smith had arrived in Washington, D.C., Bernheisel advised him to forego submitting the petition, fearing that bringing further attention to Utah in the wake of the Republican platform would be doing more hurt than good. Despite his reluctance to accept Bernheisel's recommendation, Smith soon found that all those who had once supported statehood were now reluctant to show any support for the measure, fearing that it would lead to a political grave. By the end of 1856, George A. Smith and John Taylor had both found that they received nearly as much opposition from the Democrats as from the Republicans on the topic of Utah's admission to the Union. Perhaps unaware of the wording of the Republican platform, Drummond added further credence to the Republican attack upon polygamy while presiding over a court in the furthest reaches of Utah Territory at Carson Valley. During a session of the court, Drummond called upon the grand jury to cast off all priestly yokes of oppression and studiously and honestly do their duty without fear, favor, or affection in prosecuting those who practiced plural marriage. Likely unaware that he was doing so, Drummond invoked the language of the Republican platform in calling for a remedy for the correction of that crying and most loathsome, barbarous, cruel, black, and degrading evil. Shortly after issuing this charge, Drummond abandoned his post in Utah, traveling to California and from thence back to the eastern states, where he would carry on a vicious public campaign against the Utah States in the newspapers. Although doing so in the form of confidential letters to government officials, Kinney similarly wrote scathing critiques of Utah and would heighten federal concerns over the territory. And even Stiles, despite being a Latter-day Saint, would run afoul of the Utah community, culminating in his excommunication for adultery in December 1856, his return to the States in 1857, and yet another scathing denunciation of the circumstances in Utah. Each of these critiques further strengthened the ways in which the 1856 Republican platform resonated with the American public. By calling for the eradication of both slavery and polygamy in the territories, the Republican National Platform had redefined American politics and had ushered in an era of reconstructive policies and measures. Whereas America had previously been defined by political compromises, one of which had brought about the notion of popular sovereignty, the Republican platform of 1856 eschewed the policy of compromise and took an unabashed stance against compromises of any kind upon the topics of slavery and polygamy. By labeling these two institutions as barbaric, the Republicans declared not only their vocal opposition to slavery and polygamy, but they declare without equivocation that those institutions were by nature un-American and undermined the principles upon which the nation was founded. This shift from principles of compromise toward an insistence upon abolition of barbaric practices had far-reaching effects for the nation as a whole and for Utah in particular. By June 1856, the 19th century destinies of Utah Territory had been immeasurably altered by the combined efforts of a then obscure political party and the unwitting cooperation it received from Democratic political appointees in Utah. Thank you, Brett.